Imagine if a film showed the Normandy landings taking place in East Africa. Or maybe Pickett's charge as a grand push by the Union Army against the French. Worse yet, imagine a film that doesn't just miss some of the most iconic portions of a particular battle, but gets nearly every element of it so horrifically wrong that it starts to feel almost like it was done on purpose to reinforce a flawed and potentially even nefarious narrative. Now, it may sound like I'm being dramatic there. I mean, I do have that flair, admittedly. But on the whole, if you just hear me out through this video, I think you'll see my point by the end. That the Battle of Camden scene in The Patriot is easily one of the worst, even to a moral degree, battle scenes to have ever been spat out of the little-known 10th circle of hell reserved for historical inaccuracies. It's the worst circle of them all, to be sure. So let's get started. Let us begin with our part the first: fatigue, biting insects, and evacuation. The context of battle and the condition of the armies. The Patriot's vision of the battlefield is nothing short of picturesque. A grand manor home opens to a lush, open green field. Perhaps not a manicured lawn, but with fairly short grasses and clear of any trees. The field is mostly flat, and nothing stands in the way of two opposing forces as they politely stride towards each other. It all looks wonderfully arranged, as if it was scheduled beforehand. This is nothing close to what the real battlefield was like. Historian David Smith, in his book Camden, The Annihilation of Gates's Grand Army, described the field that morning as humid and still. The battlefield was dotted with mature longleaf pine trees, bare to a height of around 40 feet, with wiregrass growing to a height of 2 to 3 feet on the ground and underbrush sparse. Marshy ground to each side, preventing either force from outflanking the other. Gates was on slightly rising ground, and Cornwallis had a creek behind him, which would cause problems if he was forced to retreat. While the ground had good visibility and clear skies, it was hardly an open field. Here are some images as to what the battlefield looks like today, much as the same as it was back then. Now, this may seem like a tiny error, something owing more to limitations in filming, the desire for a good, clean battle scene, than anything nefarious. Well, yeah, maybe. But keep these conflicting images in your mind, all of these little coincidences and these little justifiable movie magic creative license moments. Keep them all in your mind as we move on, and we'll see if they don't add up. See if there isn't any deeper significance that perhaps arises from them all. Much like the battlefield itself, the condition of the men is far prettier in the film than in reality. Let's go over a brief summary of the events that led up to the battle because they help to set the stage here. The British Army captured Charlestown after a little over a month of siege in May of 1780. General Sir Henry Clinton, in charge of the army, then launched 3 expeditions into the South Carolina back country to take 3 notable settlements there: Augusta, 96, and Camden. These expeditions featured the regular army moving in to clear resistance before leaving loyalist militias in place to defend them. Clinton would leave the southern colonies for New York just a few weeks after taking Charlestown, leaving the command of the region to Lord Cornwallis, a man with practically nothing in common with his on-screen portrayal in The Patriot, but that is a subject for another time. Meanwhile, the Continental Army, having been entirely ousted from the region, plans to make a return. Up in Virginia, Rebel General DeKalb commands 1,400 of the Army's best troops, mainly Marylanders, with a regiment from Delaware as well. They begin a long march south, and as they do, more men flock to their cause, both regular Army and militia groups as well, including 2,000 from North Carolina. Eventually, over 4,000 men would make up what became known as the Grand Army. However, it wasn't all heroics, as the force was plagued with supply shortages and couldn't forage enough to feed itself. Partway through their march of over 300 miles, General Gates, the debated hero of Saratoga, would take command. The words again of David Smith: "Although in a disheveled state and suffering terribly from hunger, fatigue, and the attentions of swarms of biting insects, the army marked the transfer of command with as much pomp and circumstance as it can muster, including a 13-gun salute." When the Grand Army reached South Carolina, a number of skirmishes were had around British forward outposts, for example Rocky Mount, where a string of 3 log cabins had been reinforced and then connected with abattis, basically converting them into a tiny little fort. And it was at this point, when these skirmishes begin, that the British, becoming alerted to the Grand Army's rapid advance towards Camden, began movements of their own. One light infantry officer would later write, "General Gates, with a force of 7,000 men, sprung from the earth like a multitude of toads from heavy rains, had driven in our outposts and had taken post within 15 miles of Camden. Lord Cornwallis fortunately arrived from town the same evening, immediately collected his scattered troops, and formed a plan of attack." And now this inflating of rebel numbers, which were closer to 4,000 rather than 7, would be a pretty common theme across the campaign, and it may have informed Cornwallis's intensity, as he took various steps, for example, bolstering his army with otherwise invalided, wounded and unfit for duty, otherwise invalided soldiers, so long as they were still capable of carrying a musket. They were marching out with them. And then they set out on that rapid march to reach Camden very quickly. The British force, mainly based in Charlestown, had to march over 100+ miles to get to Camden, and they did so in just a few days. By the end of it, they too were in a pretty bad condition, many men suffering from fever and other sickness from the terrible marshy conditions. Now, as a part of that march, Cornwallis had also transferred the army's best horses to Tarleton's cavalry, that they could reach Camden as quickly as possible. It's the role of the cavalry to do that, after all. Again, moving forward, we're going to see a number of interactions, or at least one core interaction between these two men, Cornwallis and Tarleton, that are worth paying attention to. It's worth paying attention to all of it, given the nature of their relationship in the film. But just attempting to get to the battlefield, both of the armies found themselves in an exhausted state. They had marched long distances, often with little food, through extreme heat. Both commanders drove their men hard because the coming battle was going to be vitally important, and everyone knew it. Supposedly, Lord Cornwallis even offered his men a rather rousing speech during all of this, exclaiming to his men, "Now, my brave soldiers, now an opportunity is offered for displaying your valor and sustaining the glory of British arms. All of you who are willing to face your enemies, all of you who are ambitious of military fame, stand forward, for there are 8 or 10 to 1 coming against you. Let the man who cannot bear the smell of gunpowder stand back, and all you who are determined to conquer or die, turn out." Now, they weren't outnumbered 10 to 1, more like 2 to 1, but I think it's still a pretty good way to sense the urgency of what's happening. Whether that speech ever actually took place, who knows? Although very similar words are also cited by John Robert Shaw in his own narrative, who you may actually remember that gentleman from the War is Hell collaboration. Chris the Redcoat made a video about him a while back. So if nothing else, though, some of these themes are probably going to be circling around the camp in that we see very similar language being repeated by multiple figures from the time. Now, the British were convinced that Gates was intent on forcing the issue and attacking the town of Camden directly. But interestingly enough, we don't actually know if that was the case. Gates's exact plan is debated by historians, and it's entirely possible that, rather than seeking a battle outright, he was trying to position his army more advantageously, where he'd be able to threaten the town, thus forcing the British to attack him from a bad direction, or perhaps to take a much longer flanking march around Gates's position, thus exposing the town to rebel attack. And in support of that idea, apparently Gates had dispatched a pretty significant portion of his force, 400 men and 2 cannon, to position themselves on Camden's supply lines to cut them off in the event of a more protracted engagement. And most damning of all, on what would surprisingly become the fateful night before the battle, well, Gates also gave his army a little treat. "You must observe that instead of rum, we had a gill of molasses per man served out to us, which instead of enlivening our spirits, served to purge us, as well as if we had taken gallop," which, as it sounds, is basically a laxative. "For the men all the way as we went along were every moment obliged to fall out of the ranks to evacuate." Ironically, after all of this maneuvering and rushing, at the end of it all, and unbeknownst to each other, both armies would wind up advancing on one another at the same time on a late-night march down the same path, the so-called Great Wagon Road, which is actually still visible today. At 2:30 in the morning, the advanced units of each army would meet, and fighting would break out.
The consequence of this simultaneous movement of both armies was that we met about halfway near Sutton's plantation. The moon was at full and shone beautifully. Consequently, we could see to fight in the open piney wooded plains, as well in the night as in the day. That fighting would only last a few minutes before the armies pulled away from each other. The Americans fell back a short distance to better ground, and Cornwallis would chase after them the next morning. And what would follow on that morning was the Battle of Camden.
Neither army leading up to this battle was in a good way. They were forced marching for days and nights prior to battle, suffering from a lack of food and supplies, falling ill in the extreme heat. They weren't even able to rest before the battle itself, the armies stumbling across each other in the night and being forced to lay on their arms throughout the night, lest the enemy should reappear for more skirmishing. It was rough, to say the absolute least, and you can imagine the kind of physical and emotional toll that would surely be having on even the most experienced soldiers, let alone the militiamen on both sides who had little to no experience of campaigning or of battle. So, how does the Patriot show the opening of battle the next day?
Well, first of all, we get this clip of a guy hastily fleeing his home as if the army just popped up out of the ground instead of having skirmished the night before, not that far off. This man should have been well aware that the armies were right on his doorstep and probably could have made preparations to leave well in advance. But more importantly, as we come to the soldiers, look at how fresh they all look. For the rebels, yeah, their faces are emotive with fear and anxiety, but they don't look particularly tired or worn. The British are even worse. Most of their faces are just plain, emotionless, as if they were a bunch of robots. Does anything about these men look like they've just gone through all of the experiences that I was just talking about? And beyond their expressions, look at their physical state, how incredibly clean and well-dressed these guys all are, without any dirt or grime on them, no patched clothing, anything of the sorts. It's white stockings and brushed coats all around.
Okay, now, usually the whole, oh, well, they should be dirtier, where's the mud on the uniform? That argument, it's silly, it's nonsense. Things like shaving and personal grooming, laundry services and all the like, they were all a massive part of military life in this time period. In the majority of battles, yes, they should look clean, not necessarily prim and proper, but they should look like they're taking care of themselves, absolutely. But again, the situation around Camden, it's just a little bit different. So, should the men all have, full beards and torn up clothing and mud splattered all? No, absolutely not, of course not. But things should still be looking a little bit more worn than all of this, I think. I mean, can you imagine marching over 100 miles in just a couple of days in the South Carolina summer heat with barely anything to eat at all, fighting a skirmish the night before, then staying awake all night practically, maybe a smidge or two of sleep here and there, and then managing to march out in perfect formation looking like this? Keeping in mind that that a little over half of all the soldiers present in this battle were actually militia. They weren't regular soldiers. Men who wouldn't have as nice a kit to begin with, or be anywhere near so accustomed to that level of hardship on a campaign. And of course, there's plenty of other details here which we'll touch on later, like how the British are, playing the British Grenadiers while both armies are just methodically marching up to each other, in conjunction with the portrayal of the men's physical state, which all implies right from the start that the surrounding conditions of this battle are immensely different from the reality. That this was a scenario which Gates and Cornwallis were pretty evenly matched in numbers and in condition, and they decided, as if by coordinating with each other, to have a set formal battle on open, even, perfect, clean ground in which the best man would clearly win. To an audience which is unaware of the reality behind 18th century warfare, this really just reinforces their preconceived notions that linear combat was silly, and that military leaders of this time period were stubborn and ignorant, being blinded by their idealism. And then, of course, when Martin says things like,
"Going muzzle to muzzle with redcoats in open field, it's madness,"
it only serves to reinforce that ignorance. Gibson's character acts as if this entire event was some foregone conclusion that could have been seen by anyone who was bothering to pay attention. But in reality, as you'll soon see, it was a hard-fought, precarious thing. I discuss this line in particular and how it basically amounts to emotional manipulation in my character analysis for Martin, which I'll link down below. TLDR, they demonstrate how this entire battle scene isn't actually about trying to portray the American War of Independence and how battles were fought and such, so much as it is a way to puff up the main character by making everyone else in the world dumber than him. But enough about the context behind the battle. I think in order for me to really prove my point, we need to move on. To part the second, every officer and soldier was determined to conquer or die. The real Battle of Camden.
Cornwallis was giving words of encouragement to his men when the army arrived at the ground occupied by Gates. He was a general held in high regard by his men and a far cry from the foppish old man of the movie. As usual for any army of its time, they were initially moving in column and then had to take a short time to deploy their line. And as they did so, they fell under a harsh fire of case shot from the rebel artillery, which had about 8 guns to the British 4. Another thing worth noting is that, as Smith writes, no solid shot has been recovered from the battlefield, and it would have been a poor choice in a wooded area with the opposing armies so close to each other. It appears, therefore, that artillery on both sides used case shot exclusively. Cornwallis's own regiment, the 33rd of Foot, would suffer the most from this initial onslaught, suffering up to 60 casualties before battle was even really begun. Altogether, the 33rd would lose about a third of their 300 men present for battle as casualties.
Now, as the British formed their line, they placed their best troops on the right flank, as usual. And then, funnily enough, the rebels end up doing the same thing. So both sides have their best troops on the right. Both sides also have their militia, their less experienced troops, on the left. And these fateful placements are going to influence the course of the battle immensely. Now, as the British are finishing their deployment, the rebels have already begun to advance, but steadily so. And the British actually think that the rebels are rearranging their line, that they're in disarray, and so they immediately push on to attack. First with their right flank, as Cornwallis personally orders Lieutenant Colonel Webster forward, and then with the British left under Lieutenant Colonel Lord Rawdon.
As the armies converge on each other, the British situation is hardly ideal. They're outnumbered and outgunned, and outpositioned at that. One British officer on the right flank would recount after the battle, "I assure you it was a little farcical to see us drawn up against 7,000 men who appeared formidable. I had not an idea of surviving an instant after their first volley. But our little body, regardless of their numbers and with their usual bravery and undauntedness, gave a screech that made the woods and valleys re-echo, and dashed with their bayonets into the center of them, as lions and tigers do at their prey. The miscreants, not accustomed to this method of fighting, fled before us." Indeed, exchanging very little fire at all, as the British right advances on the rebel left, they push with bayonets and manage to swiftly break right through them, despite being fired on by superior numbers the entire way. North Carolina militiaman William Gibson, it's kind of a funny name to have here, isn't it, provides a harrowing description of the event. "We had orders to wait for the word to commence firing, that the militia were in front and in a feeble condition at that time. They were fatigued. The weather was warm excessively. They had been fed a short time previously on molasses entirely. I can state on oath that I believe my gun was the first gun fired, notwithstanding the orders, for we were close to the enemy, who appeared to maneuver in contempt of us, and I fired without thinking except that I might prevent the man opposite from killing me. The discharge and loud roar soon became general from one end of the lines to the other. Amongst other things, I confess I was amongst the first that fled. The cause of that I cannot tell, except that everyone I saw was about to do the same. It was instantaneous. There was no effort to rally, no encouragement to fight. Officers and men joined in the flight. I threw away my gun and, reflecting I might be punished for being found without arms, I picked up a drum, which gave forth such sounds when touched by the twigs, I cast it away. When we had gone, we heard the roar of guns still, but we knew not why. Had we known, we might have returned. It was that portion of the army commanded by DeKalb, fighting still."
Indeed, great portions of the rebel army would stand and fight to the last, heedless of their comrades' flight. But ultimately, it was the breaking of the militia which would lead to the army's ultimate annihilation. Just behind the rebel left, the reserve of Continental soldiers from Maryland held fast. Even as panicking militiamen were fleeing through their ranks, they stood their ground. These regular troops were meant to plug any gap potentially left by the militia. But their flight was so sudden and the advance of the British troops was so quick that they didn't have time to advance, and they themselves were soon engaged as well.
Meanwhile, the British left flank has met the rebel right, and firing has commenced across the entire line. The battlefield has already become covered in a thick, hanging fog of smoke, and so precise details after the militia's initial flight are tricky to pin down. What we do know is that the rebel right was holding even if the left was collapsing, and General de Kalb launched a bayonet charge of his own which nearly broke the British line. But it wasn't enough. As the rebel left crumbled away, with the British right forcing a fight with the Marylanders further behind, a gap was forming and widening in the battle, growing up to 200 yards long. This, in turn, allowed the 33rd Regiment in the Army's center to wheel to the left and begin enfilading the rebels' right's new flank. And in the midst of the chaos, Cornwallis ordered, yes, he actually ordered it, Tarleton's cavalry to sweep through the gap. The green-jacketed Legion poured in, separated in two, and attacked both rebel lines from the rear. They were then followed up by the 71st Regiment, which was able to plug the British line's own gap. The rebels were facing a united British front, they were outflanked on numerous points, and had cavalry in their rear. Those rebels which didn't outright flee, and there was actually a significant number of them, were all picked off piecemeal. The entire affair lasted roughly 45 minutes. Never was there a more complete victory, nor did British valor and courage ever shine more brilliant than on this occasion. Every officer and soldier was determined to conquer or die, wrote one officer after the battle. And after it was done, supposedly Cornwallis was moving across the battlefield to survey the situation, presumably, and to issue orders, when he came across rebel General de Kalb, again that man who stood to the last on the rebel right flank, mortally wounded with multiple bullet and bayonet wounds. "I am sorry, sir, to see you," Cornwallis is said to have addressed him. "Not sorry that you are vanquished, but sorry to see you so badly wounded." Wouldn't that have been nice to see in the movie?
The Battle of Camden was relatively quick, but it was far from easily fought. It was a close-run thing, and understood to have been so by both sides. De Kalb very nearly broke through Lord Rawdon's line, and had he done so, who knows how events would have progressed. Even if the British would have still won the battle, it was far from a foregone conclusion. Both sides displayed a great deal of heroism and bravery in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds in a highly mobile, back and forth, maneuvering this way and that battle. And all after having dealt with days beforehand of extreme physical and mental privation. It is a fascinating story, and a deeply telling one of just how brutal the fighting of the American War of Independence could be. So, now that we know the real story, now it's time for the fun bit. Time for part the third, Over Before It Began, the Patriot's version of events.
The Patriot portrays very nearly the opposite of what actually occurred at the battle. Two large armies, basically equal in size, approach each other over a level, open, grassy field with little to no cover offered to either side. They exchange a volley each before the British charge, and it's all over. No tactical depth, no attention to the nuance of the battle or to its background, and barely any attention paid at all to the emotional experience that these men went through.
And what's worse is that not only does the scene get everything about Camden wrong, even if it were portraying a generic battle from very nearly any point in the 18th century, it would still be horrible. So in order to get to the real depths of depravity here, I want to go through the entire scene piece by piece. And as we do so, just keep in mind everything that we've already discussed about the reality of what the scene is attempting, it's what it's supposed to be portraying. If you've skipped ahead to this point in the video, then I recommend going back, watching those first two parts. It's really vital to understanding everything that I'm about to say now.
As Joker approaches the window, we first hear the sounds of battle, the thunderous booming of cannon. Conveniently enough, of course, these guns are entirely silent as he rides up to the home, enters it, and stands dramatically in the doorway. This is, of course, despite the two armies obviously being well within range of each other for really a long while. By the time we actually see them through the window, they are already within easy musket shot, let alone artillery, but we'll come to that soon. It's worth pointing out the guns themselves. The scene emphasizes the terrible effect of the British artillery, while neglecting to demonstrate even the presence of rebel artillery at all outside of this quick initial shot. Which is actually quite ironic because in the real battle, the rebel artillery was doing severe damage to the British lines before the battle was even begun. The rebels also had more cannon than the British. You know, I wonder if that exclusion, this making it seem like the British have the advantage there, I wonder if that might be a purposeful decision. I wonder why that might be done.
And that isn't even the worst of it, because wow, look at these things. These are not little field pieces, the ones that the army should be pulling along with them. These are flipping siege guns. They look like, they could be 32 pounders, something around there, at least maybe even more, I don't know. The gun carriages reach up to the guy's shoulders, for goodness sake. The rammers look like they're 10 feet long.
Guns like this cannot just be pulled by men with drag ropes like the light, small, and easily maneuvered guns we're supposed to expect to see in field engagements during the AWI. These things can't even be pulled by just one or two horses. Looks like they need an entire wagon train to effectively transport them, and moving them in battle, oh my goodness, don't even bother trying. And here we have Cornwallis with at least 3 of the things? Did they haul these guys all the way from Charlestown in that mad dash march to Camden, 100 miles in a few days? Yeah, I don't think so. Although, however, as much as I hate to admit it, there actually is something good to mention about these guns.
The Patriot does actually show one thing here that actually very few films ever manage to get right: the skipping of a cannonball. This is what made round shot so effective against linear formations, because the ball wouldn't be fired and then just embed itself into a single enemy. A round shot of 2, 4, 8, even more pounds could bowl its way through one line into another. Artillery would actually drill to fire their rounds over the heads of their own men into the enemy army so that it would, so that the artillery is both protected behind their infantry and able to hit the opponent, skipping those rounds through their ranks, taking out all sorts of men along the way. So seeing that in a film, even for a very brief moment, that's really cool. But and it's also important, of course, to remember that of all of the battles where we could have had this portrayed, it just so happens to be in the one battle where round shot wasn't used at all, as far as we're best aware. Remember, it's expected that the artillery at Camden used case or canister shot pretty much exclusively, because the real battlefield was obviously covered in trees and the ground was soft and marshy, so it would have altogether been the worst place to use the round shot.
Oh, and one more thing. The artillery is being manned by red-coated army soldiers, not men of the blue-coated Royal Artillery, so there's also that. But let's move on now to this iconic shot here. Ooh, oh, wow, yeah. British colors flying as the drummers and fifers play out their little tune. Oh, it's so polite. Warfare was so silly back in those days, wasn't it? Well, to start with, these are the wrong colors. A set of white regimental colors like this ought to belong to a white-faced regiment, the green with green, although the Patriot never seems to acknowledge any color facings except for blue. During the American War, a lot of times you wouldn't actually expect to see your regiment's colors on the field with them for a variety of reasons, although during the Battle of Camden, we do have evidence that a number of such flags were carried, so that's fine.
But what isn't fine is how incredibly slowly these guys are advancing. And under music? Whereas in the real battle, again, the British had fallen under intense fire basically right off the bat, and they were rushing in. They were suffering a lot of case shot falling all around them. They had to get going. They didn't march up steadily, stop, and then take turns firing a very steady volley like we see here. They fixed bayonets. They rushed in with a battle cry. I think they did give like a volley before the final push, but it was quick. It was all very, very quick with speed. Remember, like tigers after their prey and all that? No music, no minding the step. They were under fire. But what we see here are incredibly slow, incredibly close order formations sauntering up to one another silently. Yeah, let's talk about their order for a little bit.
Because I genuinely have no idea what this is supposed to be. The Battle of Camden saw each side with one primary line and a few reserves behind them. It was a small battle of only a few thousand men. But what we have here it's just madness. It's like every regiment has been split up into their individual subdivisions and is marching in a checkerboard pattern as if to ensure that as little soldiers as possible will actually be presenting their front and able to fire. Both armies are actively restricting their firepower for no discernible reason here. I mean, like, yeah, sure, it's important to keep reserves, but this is insane. This is extreme. And also, why is the color reserve at the very front? They should probably be more to the rear in any given regiment, considering how important they are. Same thing for the musicians. And where did that other set even get to? They run halfway across to the other side of the field in the last few seconds or something? Oh, no, okay. There they are. Those colors reappear later on. I guess they just phased out of the simulation for a little bit. No, that's cool. That's fine. And of course now the green is at the front alone, and also the whole color reserve is gone. Okay, yeah, sure, why not? Consistency, overrated. Who needs it?
So the rebels finally take aim and start shooting, or at least they pretend to do so. Half these guys are either aiming at the sky or at the ground, probably because none of them are bothering to look down the barrel, as if they'd never fired a gun before. Utterly ridiculous. Again, topic for another day, all of that terrible, terrible drill. The worst part, though, is again, just how long, how slow it takes for the rebels to start opening fire. From the very beginning of this scene, they were already well within range, and yet both sides are continuing this slow and steady pace towards one another before only stopping at just hilariously close ranges from one another. Now, okay, maybe at the real Battle of Camden, I'm sure that the firefights were actually really close. That's also because they were in insanely densely wooded terrain. They weren't on a vast open field like this. So how close is hilariously close?
Well, when I first started researching for this video, I received an email from a man named Matthew, who was a military pilot that operated UAVs and has extensive knowledge of taking measurements from very simple and sometimes low-quality photographs like this one. So he did all sorts of fancy mathematics and measurements and all the rest. You can check all of his work if you'd like by following along with these pages, and he came to this conclusion: that from the furthest point we see them, just slightly after the rebels start firing, the British are already within 55 meters, only 60 yards away. On an open field like this, the rebels could have been firing at them from twice that distance and still have been scoring hits pretty reliably.
Okay, so maybe they just want to save their fire until that last possible second, really make sure that that first volley is a good one. They did do that sort of thing historically, fairly often, in fact.
But then, now that they're taking that effective fire, the British are still just slowly marching up to them. Then finally, the British halt their march and fire their first volley at only 20 meters, 20 yards away. That is an absolutely devastating distance. That is point-blank range by every measure. And then, though, after delivering that, they're just standing there. And they stand there, and they wait, and they wait. They don't do anything.
Why aren't they charging? Why? They're just giving the enemy time to stand there and reload. And a lot of those guys do happen to fire yet another volley in the time that the British could have been on them.
So now, finally, as the cavalry push in from the British left flank, not its center as it should be, the rebels just immediately, all of them, begin to break and run at the same exact time. The British never made contact with them. There's absolutely no difference in motions between any of the flanks, and we never get to see any of the dramatic last stands that multiple groups of rebels actually made. It's also worth pointing out here that there are no militia shown at this battle, despite the fact that they were such a vital element as to how the battle actually played out. Instead, it's all regulars on both sides.
And if you look at how the British infantry charge, it's only shown for a very brief moment, but it's absolutely horrendous. It's like the individual men all just independently decided to book it for the enemy, and their buddies just followed them piecemeal. It's just another example of how it feels like nobody in Hollywood even bothers to stop and think for a moment about how a charge actually happens. Because, yes, while you want your men to get to the objective quickly, you also want to make sure that they get there together as a unit. The need for that, it may not be as strict, sure, when the enemy is in a total rout, but any officer who wants to keep control over his men is still going to understand the need for a unit to keep its cohesion. And again, that is how the charges all actually took place at Camden. They took place as flanks, as units, men standing with their subdivisions as they pushed in together with bayonets rather than just a race to the end.
Also, just as a little aside here, when General O'Hara, who actually he shouldn't even be at this battle, by the by, when he's looking out at the retreating rebels, where exactly is he meant to be standing?
Is the British General Staff just like hanging out behind the rebels to the side? Like, are they not behind their own men? I mean, even if you look at the angles and whatnot, like the rebels are going that way, the British are charging over here, so he would be... Are they standing next to the Manor House? Did Mel and Joker just like walk past Cornwallis and the entire British General Staff when they were going into the house? What's going on? Don't movies, like, aren't they supposed to have people for this kind of stuff? Like, consistency in the script, maybe thinking about, like, I don't know, where people basically are in the world as they interact, something like that?
Well, what's going on is that this scene is absolutely terrible in just about every imaginable sense. And of course, after the battle, we even get this added little gem where Cornwallis will admonish Tavington for charging the enemy lines without orders. Whereas in the real battle, you'll recall, it was literally the exact opposite. Cornwallis ordering the cavalry forward to exploit a gap that was left by the infantry's initial charge, rather than the other way around. This purposeful alteration from the real history serves literally no other purpose but then to completely butcher and dehumanize multiple characters as efficiently and quickly as possible. O'Hara into the sycophantic fop.
It appears that Colonel Tavington prefers to follow his own commands.
Cornwallis into the stuffy traditionalist.
Always too early. Always too eager for glory.
And Tarleton into the lunatic villain. It's all just so tired and horrible and wrong. Not just historically wrong, I would argue morally as well. Which really is, I think, just an excellent way to describe this entire battle sequence. And so with that, let us come to our conclusion.
The Battle of Camden was a fascinating example of the fast-moving, small-scale operations that were iconic to the American War of Independence, the thing that like set it out from so many traditional European theaters. It featured immense courage, it featured zeal on the part of both armies, which had dealt prior to the battle with days of forced marches, a lack of food and supplies, and the searing South Carolina summer. By simplifying and dumbing down the complexities of this battle, it discredits everyone who took part within it. It discredits the British, who rather than tromping over a foe that never stood a chance, took up the charge against an enemy that was waiting for them in a superior position with superior numbers. Men like Lord Rawdon. It discredits the rebels, who against such a ferocious charge, as their lines were breaking all around them and cavalry were sweeping into their rear, stood their ground and fought to the bitter end. Men like de Kalb. It even discredits those soldiers, those militiamen, who fled and broke away from the battle by portraying them all as continental professionals who fled at the first sight of danger, rather than the reality that they were exhausted, tired, and overwhelmed militiamen who had never seen battle before. As a petition of just those militiamen to the Virginia State Legislature in 1780 would read, "We were marched almost night and day and kept on half allowances of flour for 8 or 10 days before the battle. That from these circumstances, and being wholly unacquainted with military discipline, which we had not had time to learn, greatly exhausted by fatigue at the hot season which we had not been inured to, dispirited for want of rest and diet, and panic-struck by the noise and terror of a battle which was entirely new to most of us, we, amongst others, officers and privates, were so unhappy as to abandon the field of battle." Nor did the British think so poorly of the rebel army as the creators of this film would seem to. After the fact, Sergeant Roger Lamb, 23rd Regiment of Foot, would write, "In justice to the North Carolina militia, it should be remarked that part of the brigade, commanded by General Gregory, acquitted themselves well. They kept the field while they had a cartridge to fire." Indeed, I think that many of the men who were actually present at this battle, if not all of them, would take a pretty severe issue with this portrayal, on multiple levels, on a moral level even. And as a result, I think that if you have any respect for any of those men, that you should as well. Which is also just such a shame, because as usual, the film could have done so much better. I mean, I feel like there are some amazing individual little moments that could really do well to demonstrate the reality of this battle and of linear warfare more broadly, if only they weren't in such a damaging context. I mean, look at this scene here. Look at the panic, the pain that's evident in the rebel line as they suffer the devastation of a volley, or the demonstration of how brutal a cavalry charge could be on a line that isn't standing firm. Even that bouncing cannonball taking off a man's head, it's the kind of brutality, the kind of terror that we so rarely see in portrayals of linear warfare. It's a massive missed opportunity to do some real good for the public awareness of this time period. Yet it feels like at every possible turn, the film does everything possible to sabotage that real history. It isn't just bad, it isn't just like there's a few mistakes in terms of historical accuracy, it's outright nefarious. And it's sad to see. But oh well, never mind. What I can appreciate is the time that you've spent with me here today. And I thank you for it, and I hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you're interested in supporting my work, then you can do so via Patreon, or you can give me a one-time gift on Ko-Fi, or you can even book me on Cameo, something a little bit more fun. It's all listed down below, and they're all genuinely amazing ways to help me to keep on doing what I do. Thank you. And until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.